Hello there and welcome. In the previous episode, we added MySQL into our server, and this replaces the old way we used to save data using JSONs. Now we can use our database manager to add users, to get users, and basically save and fetch any kind of data that we want, and using a database is much more efficient. We also learned how to do it using Docker, so our database is now in a container, and if we need to update it or manage it later on, it will be much easier because it's a Docker container and not just a local installation. Now at this point, our database manager, which is just a Python script, is not persistent. So if we restart our server, we are going to have to manually start it, and we want to basically convert it into a service the same way our simple endpoints worked before, okay? Now we want to convert our database manager script into a service. If we do ls and we go into our Unity server folder, we can find our database manager Python script that we created in the previous episode, and we can also find our previous endpoint services that we created. We can also find the folder that contains all the JSON data. So all of this will be gone in this episode because we're going to start using the database manager, and this will actually communicate with our SQL database, and it's going to save data and it's going to fetch data. So it's some kind of middleman between our Unity application and the database. So we don't need all of this, but before we actually delete this, we want to make sure that our database manager is working and everything is set up, and only then we're going to remove all of this. Now again, if your project is small and you don't need a database and you just want to keep using JSON, maybe you want to keep using this for other configurations, right? Maybe you want to save all of the data, all of the user data or the player data inside the database, but for different configurations, you want to still use the JSON functionality, so you can still keep it. It's really up to you. Remember that our simple endpoint v2 runs on port 5001, and we set our database manager to run on port 5002. So they will not conflict and you can still access them separately, okay? Now we already did this before. We just want to turn our Python script, this database manager, into a service. And this way, when we close our server, when we reboot it or when we stop it and we start it again, it will still be active, the service will be active, and we are going to be able to access this database manager. Because at this point, if we try to do it, it's not going to work because it's just a script that needs to be executed manually. So for this, we're going to basically do sudo nano, and we're going to create a file, a unit file for the service. And we already did this for both of these simple endpoints before. So we go into etc systemd system, and this is the folder where all the unit files are sitting. Of course, we can just go there and then do the changes, but we can also provide a full path, and this way it's going to be faster. And now we're going to create a unit file. So we're going to name it database-manager.service. Okay, so it's a unit file. It should end with service.service. And because we said nano, it's going to create this file. So we press enter. And now we need to add the unit file logic, and this is usually the same thing. We simply change the actual Python file that it's going to execute. And again, I'm going to provide a link in the description for the content of this unit file. So this is going to be just a few lines of code. You're going to copy all of this, and then you're going to paste it inside. And I already specified the name of the Python file because this service simply looks for a file, for a Python file, and it will execute it as the server is getting rebooted. Okay, so it's going to basically execute the file for us, so we don't need to do this manually. If your path is different, if it's not user etc and then Unity server and then the file, if you place it somewhere else, of course, you need to change the path. And the same way for the working directory. So this is the directory the Python file is inside. So this part over here is always going to be the beginning of this, okay? Just without the file. So if something is different for you, or maybe you have a different name for a user, then update it as you need. But for us, this is the way it's going to be, especially if you just follow everything I'm doing. So now we're going to save it. So Control X, Y, and enter. The next thing we want to do is start this database manager service, because right now we just created it, but it's still not running. So in order to actually start it, we first need our system to recognize it, because at this point it doesn't even recognize it. In order for the system to recognize it, we're going to do sudo systemctl daemon reload, and then we're going to start the service. So sudo systemctl start database manager, and this is basically the name of the service, right? Service. Oh yes, service. And again, we need to also enable it. So you can simply press up and then it will fill in exactly the same thing and enable. Now it was enabled, and to make sure that it's actually enabled, we're going to again press up, and this time we're going to change this to status. And we can see that the service is running. We can see over here active and it's enabled. And we can also see some information, for example, that it's running on the local host and the port that we specified, 5002, okay? So everything is working correctly. And now we basically can access it. And if we close this entire server and we reboot the instance and we stop it, and it doesn't matter whatever we do, if we start the server again, this service is going to start by itself and we don't need to touch it anymore. But the same thing happens for these two, and we don't really need them anymore. So you can keep them, okay? You can keep them, or we can basically disable these services, because each service that is running, it takes some resources from the system. You can see that it takes some performance on the CPU and memory, and it also uses a task. So eventually, if you just have a lot of services that you're not even using, they are going to impact the performance of your server. Now, of course, these are very simple services, so they're not very impactful, but imagine you have a lot of them and you always forget to delete the old ones. Eventually, it's going to stack up and you're going to feel the impact. So now let's just remove these two, and let's also delete this thing over here. Let's first clear everything. Let's ls. And the proper way to do it is not by deleting these files, because remember, we still have the service files inside of the system folder. And what will happen is that the service will still run, and it will simply not find these Python files, and it will give us errors. So this is not the correct way to remove all services. We first need to actually stop and remove the services. So if we want to see how it's done, we can basically stop the service. But if we want to know what is the service name, because maybe the name is different and not the same as the Python file, we can simply go to cd etc systemd system ls, and we can see all the different service files. And we have our database manager service, but over here we can also find our simple endpoint service, okay? So to do this, we simply do sudo systemctl stop, and the service name, which is simple endpoint service. So now it was stopped, but we also want to disable it. So again, we press up, and this time we use disable. And the difference between stop and disable is that stopping it will just stop it right now. But if we restart the server, it will start again. That's why we also need to disable it. And if it's disabled, then it will not start again. And now we can finally remove this unit file. So we're going to do sudo rm, that stands for remove. And because we are already inside of this folder, we simply need to provide the name of this file. And now if we do ls again, we can see that this file is gone. Now, of course, you can also reload the entire system like we did before, but there's no need. When we start our server again, it will simply stop running the service. And even now we can do sudo systemctl status and the name of the service, which is simple endpoint service. And we can see that it did not find the service. Now we can go back to our Unity server folder. So we do cd and again cd, and we go to home, cd home, and then cd ec2 user, and then cd Unity server, and now we are inside the Unity server folder. Let's just clear. Let's ls, and now we can remove both of these Python files. Again, you can keep them. Maybe you want some of this JSON functionality in the future, but you can also go to the first episodes of this series if you want to. I just want to remove them because we don't need them. So we don't need anything. We don't need this simple endpoint 1, simple endpoint 2, and all player data. So let's remove them. I don't know if it will allow us without permission, so let's do sudo rm simple endpoint Python, and then again we're going to do the same thing v2, and we're going to do the same for this folder, so all player data. Oh yes, of course, because it's a directory, we also need to say sudo rm -r, okay? And this will basically delete the folder and also all of its contents. So all player data, and now it was removed. If we do ls again, everything was deleted, and we are only left with this database manager. Now you may ask why these were green and this is not green. This is just because we made them into executables. We don't really need to do this. Our service file will still execute this Python file, and it doesn't really need these extra permissions, so we don't need to do this anymore. Now we can access our database manager script, this one, because the service is running and it's executing it automatically, okay? So we can do the same thing, and we can make sure by simply going to the URL bar and trying to access this endpoint, okay? So we're going to copy our new public IP. We're going to use port 5002, and we're going to use the get all users. Yes. Okay, so you can see we got the user, the mock user that we created in the previous episode. So we can actually access this endpoint, and it means that although we did not execute this manually, right, it is still running because the service that we created is running it. And now even if we stop this instance and I don't know what happened here, but if we stop this instance and we reboot it, it will automatically run this database manager script because we have a service. And we're basically done with the functionality on the server side. Now all we need to do is go into our Unity project and change the logic over there in order to work with the new script, okay? So inside of our demo project, we're going to open our API client, and as we can see, it sends a JSON to these two endpoints, and it's not going to work with our new setup because in our database manager, we have a lot of different methods. We have add user, update user, get all users. We have a lot of different things that we're not even using over here. So we need to change this entire API client script, okay? Again, I'm going to provide you a link in the description for the new API client script. You're going to simply copy everything and you're going to select, Control A, delete, and paste the new script over here. So we're going to go over the script and I'm going to explain it a bit. Again, don't forget to change your new public IP. So go back into your instance. Over here, copy the new public IP and change it. So now what happens inside of this script? First of all, we have the different constants for the different endpoints. If in the future you want to add more endpoints, you can basically add them over here, but these are just the names. So instead of adding this entire thing and then saying get all users, we don't need to do this. This is not efficient. We're simply going to take this and paste it over here into the string. The next thing is our user data class. So previously it was named save data, but now we're going to rename it to user data because it makes more sense. And over here inside the code that I provided you, the ID is an integer, okay? So it depends on your game, and if you really want to use the player ID like we are doing, right, by getting the device unique identifier, if you're doing this way, you're not going to be able to save it as an integer because this is a string. It contains letters, it contains numbers. We are not going to be able to save it as an integer. But the code is using ints, and also the database manager script is using ints, okay? So we are going to have to change the way it works, especially in the database manager script. So I'm going to change this to use a string. And we're also going to rename this, or basically to rename it over here inside the game manager to be user data. So simply right click on save data, and I think it's not going to work. So just rename it to user data, copy this, and then everywhere you see save data, simply change it to user data. I think we don't have a lot of them because now we want to use this user data. Again, this will be changed, so we need to check. Okay, we have ID, we have score. So let's change player ID. We can also right click rename. Now, again, it's not going to give me because we're changing the new values. So let's rename it to ID, and this will be score. And let's see if we need to change it somewhere else. Score. I think that's it. It's not good that we have this one over here, the global one, as score. We can rename this to be current score, okay? Current score, just so it doesn't get confused with the actual data class. So current score, this will be the current score, but this will be the score. Let's just go back into our script and just understand the logic behind of it. As we know, this is the same like before, but over here we now have separate methods for the different actions. We have add user, update user, get all users, and get user ID. And all of these methods exist inside of the database manager, right? we have add user, update user, get all users. So these are all of the endpoints, right? These are the endpoints that we have on this new service. And each endpoint basically does something with the database. If we want to add a user, we're going to use a post request. If we want to get all users, we're going to use a get request. If we want to update the user, we're going to use a put request. So a put request is not very popular, but it's actually a type of request that is used to update data, okay? Not to create data or get data, but to update data. And each one of them is going to send the relevant endpoint, right? These endpoints. And it's also going to send a callback, especially for get requests, because we want to get information back. And I already talked about callbacks when we created the previous API client. So get user by ID and get all users use a callback. But for these ones, we simply want to send inside the user data, and the user data will extract the ID and score over here as parameters. And each one has its own logic. For example, the post one takes the user data and it converts it into JSON. Now you may be confused, why are we using JSON if we're not actually sending a JSON? But we are. We're sending a JSON as a body, because in a post request, we need to send a body inside of this request. And the body is this ID and score. You remember in the previous episode, we tried to do this post request and we needed to provide the ID and the score, and it was inside of a body. That's why we use a JSON. We convert this user data into a JSON, and then we send the JSON as the body of this request. Then we also have the header, and that's it, right? This is for a post request. For a get request, we don't need all of this because we basically just provide the endpoint and we say, give me something, give me all of this information. Now for get user by ID, we are providing a user ID, but we already make it a part of the actual endpoint. So get user by ID, and we provide the user ID as a parameter, and then we send it over here inside the get request, and it will take the base URL and the endpoint. So this endpoint already contains the user ID, right? We can see it over here. Endpoint and then user ID. So again, I don't want to go over each of these lines because it's very similar to what we had before with the API client, okay? Most of this still stays the same. It's just that we divided this into different request types: get request, put request, and post request. The important part is that these ones are private, but these ones are public. So we're actually using these ones from the game manager. Now inside the game manager, we need to do a few changes. For example, we need to change some of these methods because we don't have get save data anymore. What we do want to have is get user by ID, right? Because we have a user, the user of this device. He has an ID and we need to get the score. So instead of this, we're going to use get user by ID. Now we need to provide the user ID and the callback. So we're basically going to take this and paste it first and then the callback. So this is the callback and this is the user ID. Now it gives us an error because this will return a string, but the get user by ID expects an integer. So we're going to change this as well into a string, okay? And now it will simply take the string and paste it over here. So I'm not going to do these changes in the original script, the one that I'm going to provide to you. So you need to do these changes, okay? Just change this into a string. Okay, so now we have an error with the callback. And again, this is just because of the old way the callback worked. If we go to the actual callback method, we can see that it expects user data. This is what we did before. And then we can take this user data and extract the score and also set the score over here. And later we can also take the user ID, but right now we are not using a user data for the callback. If we go over here, we can see that our callback is of type string, because when we receive the result, we receive it as a string, and then we invoke the callback as a string. So this may be confusing a bit, especially if you don't know a lot about callbacks, but let me just fix this. We are going to convert this response, which is a string, into a data class. So user data, and we're going to use our JSON utility from JSON this time. And we're going to use the user data class, and we're going to paste inside the response. So now it's going to take this response, which is a text, and convert it into a data class, and we're going to set the data class into the callback. Now, of course, it's not going to receive it because the callback is currently a string, so we simply need to change it. So now everywhere you see your callback, simply change the type to user data. And also over here, and also over here. We don't have any more, right? And now inside the game manager, everything will work as it used to, because now the callback will be of user data type. And also over here, we don't get this error anymore. Now we need to do this change for the other one. So let's copy this entire thing, get user by ID. So instead of get save data, we're going to replace it. And I think that's it. Now we need to change this one, because this one sends the save data. So basically it adds new data. And we do this only when the current score is bigger than the player high score. So what we can use is update user. That's it. Then we send inside the save data, and everything will work as it used to. But now we get another problem. What if we don't find a user? What if this user doesn't exist when we first do this? When we try to get it by ID. We provide some kind of ID, but this ID doesn't exist. Then what will happen is that this callback is going to be called, but we're going to get this. So we can simply add a new user when this happens. So over here, we're going to add a new user when we don't have a user. So user data, new user data. And because we don't have a constructor, we need to assign each one of these values separately. So user data ID will be get player ID. And then user data score will be 0, right? Because if it's a new user, the current score should be 0. And we use our API client, add user method, and we send inside the user data. Now again, this will happen for the first time and the only time when we first try to get data for a user that doesn't exist. Now, everything should work, okay? Everything should work. We should start the game. It will create our user automatically, but it will not happen because of the way our database manager is creating the table, okay? So in the next episode, we are going to change our database manager script a bit more. We are going to basically change it to receive a string instead of an integer. And as I told you, the problem is not with these methods because it's Python and Python doesn't really care if it's an integer or a string. The problem is over here when we first create this table inside of the database. It should create a string. So in the next episode, we are going to change this to actually receive a string, but it's not enough. we also need to delete this table that was created. Because remember, if you already ran this container and this script, it created a table, and now we have this table inside of the database. So we want to delete this user's table and create a new table. So we are going to do this in the next episode because I don't want the episode to be too long. And when we are going to do this, then we can start our game and everything is going to work as we want. So that's all for this episode. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you're still not a subscriber. If you have any questions or any problems, let me know. And yes, I know that I could have give you the entire script and without changing things, but sometimes I just realize things a bit later, and that's why we do all of these modifications. And it's also good for you to do something and not just listen to me, because it can be boring. And if you do some things and do some changes, you can actually learn from it. So I'll see you in the next episode.